Hey, thanks, Bobby, for having us on again. I'm going to pass it over to Robert Bauer and let him take it over.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Bob Newton, and thank you, Bobby, and everybody else involved on the show tonight. This is the fourth in the series of the USOKS radio programs on global connections. And we have a very interesting guest tonight, Laird Scranton, who has got a fascinating background as well as a lot of research that he has done over the years. And we're going to get into that. We also have Stephen Strong. Are we okay?
Yeah, we're okay.
Yep. We've got Evan and Stephen Strong down in Oz, and they'll be talking about some of the research as well. So let's Laird. I got to tell you, your background is both in English as well as in technology and computer programming is something both near and dear to my heart. And as a autodidactic semiotician, I think we're going to find some interesting stuff to talk about in the work that you've done. But before we get into that, why don't you give us a little bit of a background on yourself so that the listeners can have a better idea of where some of the research that you've done has generated from.
Okay. Well, thanks very much, Robert. I really appreciate talking with you guys today. My background was as a software designer. My degree, as you said, was in English. And I became interested in ancient mysteries in the early 1990s when my wife gave me a book about ancient mysteries that put me on to a little tribe called the Dogon in Africa, a modern-day tribe. And so 3 books on cosmology. I have a 4th at the publisher right now and a 5th in the computer on the way about different aspects of ancient cosmological traditions and language. Basically, my approach is to compare similar traditions sort of the same way that English scholars tried to reconcile various versions of Shakespeare's plays to come up with definitive versions. And that's basically what I see myself as doing. I try to learn more through these comparisons of symbols and language and myths. And my understanding at this point is that I'm looking at traditions that started out very similarly to one another, but evolved somewhat differently from each other.
It's quite fascinating how there's been so much diversity as far as the different civilizations and cultures throughout time, symbology, and there's a lot of connections that you found.
Yes, there are a lot, and part of the process is trying to come up with ways make relations that are what I call anchored. The big risk for someone like me is really their own wishfulness, the idea that we're wired to see certain patterns. You know, you look up in the sky and you see a cloud, and what child hasn't imagined pictures that aren't really there, but your brain puts them there. When you're researching ancient mysteries, you have to find ways of preventing your own brain from doing that.
Yeah, and that seems to have come through your work on the Dogon. One of the things that you have found, and I think you had actually in relation to the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphology with the Dogon. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. When I first got interested, because they had some astronomical knowledge they shouldn't have, because they are what's called a modern-day primitive tribe. It's a tribe that still exists, where you can sit down and talk to a living priest, but they don't have technology the way we do. They don't have popes. And so they knew some things about the stars of Sirius. They knew that there were really 2 stars there, not 1. And they knew the orbital period for the 2 stars. But when I got into looking at the tradition, I discovered that it was sort of a crossroads for ancient religions. They do some things like ancient Judaism and some things like ancient Egypt and other things like ancient Buddhism. And so I figured whatever I learned about that culture was going to tell me a lot about these other cultures.
And what you found is something called, in Buddhism, adequate symbols?
That's one of the things that I found. The concept in Buddhism of an adequate symbol is the idea of a symbol that can't lose its meaning. Even if the long trail of initiates who study it forget what it means, the symbol still retains its meaning. And I realized that the only way that could happen is if the symbol was the image of something that you could actually see in nature. And so in the Dogon tradition, where they're describing how their tribal god created matter, they're using the shape of an electron orbit to represent the concept of an electron. And there's several other shapes in the cosmology where these are things that you can actually, if you had the right equipment, you could actually image the thing. You use an electron microscope and you can produce an image that looks just like what the Dogon drawing is.
And that seems to permeate throughout the various, well, if you look at the Dogon symbology and their mythology, there's a lot of people who have talked about them over the last decade or two. And I think one of the myths may be that people have, I think it was probably from Robert Temple's book, about how the Dogon said that they came from Sirius, but that's not really what they said. Is that correct?
Well, there are connections. Okay, there are connections to Sirius, just as there are in a lot of the ancient creation traditions. But one of the tricks in dealing with this material is trying to distinguish what's a mythical statement from what's supposed to be taken as a factual statement. And part of what helps us pin that down is examining the words. There are some conventions that somebody used when they put this system together that make it easier for somebody like me. For example, every term of the cosmology carries at least two meanings, and those meanings are distanced from one another logically, so that knowing the first meaning doesn't let you guess the second meaning. And so now when you find the same disconnected meanings associated with the same concept in another culture, sometimes associated with the same pronunciation and sometimes not, you have a lock on a correlation between the terms. You know they're talking about the same thing. And the more cultures you can get aligned that way, where they're all talking about the same thing, the more of a three-dimensional picture you can get of what they're talking about.
And how does that translate into the connection you found with the Egyptian hieroglyphs?
Okay, well, I noticed that there were a set of Dogon drawings. Every time they talk about a concept, their priests say that they are incapable of talking about a concept without also drawing it. So they have drawings associated with each concept, and I noticed that some of those drawings looked like Egyptian hieroglyphs and actually carried the same symbolism as the Egyptian hieroglyph was thought to have. And so I started asking myself, is it possible that these symbols of writing some of the symbols of writing came out of the pre-existing cosmology? And I started examining Egyptian words and discovered some pretty interesting things about the words.
Now, you've also written a book, and it's called the Velikovsky Heresies. Do you see any connection between some of the Dogon mythologies and some of the research and work of Velikovsky?
Well, the connection is more that Velikovsky is sort of a kindred spirit. He was working from ancient texts, he was working from ancient myths, and he was trying to again distinguish between what were factual statements and what were mythical or symbolic statements. And so I had been interested in Velikovsky for many years because I went to high school in Portland, Oregon, which had been a seat of student support for him back in the 1950s when he wrote. And so I knew about his controversial books, and I had always wanted to write a book that would talk about how the latest science applied to his theories.
And do you see anything in the Dogon mythology that made some of the cosmological work that Velikovsky came up with? In other words, is there any correlation between some of the things that they talk about in their history and what Velikovsky, particularly as you look in that 750 to 1500 BC time frame when there was, the changes that occurred both in climate as well as in the calendrical understanding of various cultures? Do you see anything in the Dogon stories that may prove or indicate some of Velikovsky's theories might have some justification to them?
Well, one area in particular you touched on were the calendars. The Dogon have all the same calendars that ancient Egypt had. And the Dogon references look as if they are very early Egyptian references, which means they would date from around 3000 BC, not 1500. And that's an advantage to have a culture to compare to that preserves that. Some examples are they have the calendar without the intercalary days that were added early in Egypt, and they have all the cosmology, but they don't have the written language, which also appeared early in Egypt. So it looks like we're looking at a very early version here. So having the Dogon calendars to compare to gave me a point of reference to try to judge one of Velikovsky's claims, which is that in ancient times there actually had been a 360-day year that physically changed around 750 BC and became 365 days. And so all that exploration, the Dogen references helped a lot with that.
So do you think, what are your thoughts on the causation of that 360 to 365 period change? What, are you seeing anything from the work of Velikovsky or even Walter Condon or any others like that?
Well, the issue is still ambiguous. Every reference that could support a 360-day year in ancient times also supports a 365-day. The Egyptian textual references are all ambiguous. They're given, the calendar names for their lunar calendar were the same as, the month names were the same as for their solar calendar, so it's hard to tell. But there are some telling scientific facts. For example, I discovered, working with a book called, East Asian Archaeoastronomy is the name of the book, made a point that I had never been aware of before, and that is that every total eclipse that has happened since 709 BC, they can use computer programs to retrogressively calculate and verify that, yes, a total eclipse happened in this place on this date. When you move before 709 BC, not a single total eclipse can be verified. And the only way that can happen is if there was some kind of a change of the moon relationship. And so that difficulty moving against that Velikovsky says something.
That's fascinating. You have obviously followed or are aware. What are your thoughts in relation to theories as far as Walter's work is?
Walter is a friend of mine. A lot of the success that my books have had has become, and Walter's research into various stars to the studies. In fact, the latest book I'm working on, one of the biases that I think it lends validator's point of view that motion of the stars that we perceive from the Earth, rather than a wobble in our planet, is actually caused by another rotation that that hadn't been identified in our.
One of his ability of in binary relationships is that something that makes sense?
Yeah, Dogen draw make that seem likely. The Dogen say that our whole area of, and there's a suggestion that there's a rotation going on there. One of the indicators, if you imagine that you were sitting in the playground, a child's merry-go-round, you were sitting on one side and I was sitting directly across from you, and the Strong brothers spun we'd noticed that everything around us was spinning except each other. Relative to ourselves, we would think that the other person wasn't moving. And that's the kind of thing that happens between the Earth and Sirius with precession. There are certain stars that don't precess.
And what are your thoughts on the helical trajectory of our solar system as opposed to the helical model that is in our classical science and physics today?
Well, there are references that I'm currently working on with the book that I'm writing that make the structure of the universe as it's described in some of these ancient traditions look an awful lot like the spiral of DNA, the heliacal shape. So I would say that there's support for that idea in the ancient traditions.
Now, in your work in looking at ancient civilizations and their symbology and mythos, what role do you see catastrophism playing in a lot of those stories and the mythos that they pass down?
Well, first of all, pretty much every reference begins at the end of the Ice Age, so clearly big things happened there. That I've seen references that suggest that there was beautiful artwork being done just before the Ice Age and very primitive artwork being done after the same sites. Clearly something happened around the end of the Ice Age that was catastrophic to whatever civilization had been established at that point. And all of the ancient cultures that I study make reference back to a time. The Egyptians was restored to humanity. So based on the Dogen perspective, I would say that their belief is that something before that catastrophe.
So what are your thoughts about some of the theories regarding not only the Atlantean stories, which seem to be at least from the research that's out there in the 20,000 or so before present time frame, but also those that go further back, the Mu and Lemurian, into the 50 to 100,000 year range. What are your thoughts there?
Well, one of the cultures that I study is a little-known Tibetan tribe. They're actually from the borderland between Tibet and China, called the Na-Ki, and they're the preservers of the last hieroglyphic language in the world. They're still a tribe, and they have a living language with texts that they write. So, from their perspective, the language suggests that the concept of Mu is something that was real. The difficulty is that there are also cosmological concepts that that relate to that pronunciation Mu that are hard to untangle from the historical aspect of it. But it looks to me, if someone said, press the stopwatch and said, "Time's up, you have to tell me what you think," I would say that there were civilizations before the Ice Age that met with destruction because of the end of the Ice Age.
And the civilizations prior to the Ice Age, do you see any cosmological or even terrestrial events that may have altered or interfered with an order of things that were going on in the 50 to 100,000 year time frame?
Yes, and actually one of them is very interesting. I came across a reference just this week, a description of how the tribal god of one of these cultures created the universe. And they gave very specific instructions about what this tribal god had done. The problem was that the instructions reverse the cardinal point directions the way that we look at them, where they were suggesting that their god was rotating beginning facing west, and then turned from right to left, and in his first turn turned to north, to east, and then to south. And so the entire perspective of that reference is the reverse of what we understand the directions to be. So that tends to support, for me, the idea that there has been a tipping of the planet in relation to north and south, the reversals of north and south. And any tip like that would have created havoc.
Now, do you think that was a result of a magnetic pole shift or crustal displacement or a combination of the two? What's your thoughts there?
Well, it can't really be crustal displacement unless for some reason it entirely stopped at the point that happened last time, because we have a great pyramid that's perfectly aligned to north, south, east, and west, and any slippage in the crust would have thrown it out of alignment. So I don't subscribe to the idea of crustal shift, although I do think it's likely that we've had tipping of the axis that's probably magnetically induced.
Well, and that would beg the question as to how old do you think the pyramids actually are? I mean,
well,
for example, let's say that they were built after or at the end of the last ice age, as opposed to previous 50, 100,000 years ago, where there may have been some different kinds. Is that a plausible concept in your opinion?
There are numerous references at Giza that point to about the 10,500 BC time frame that make it pretty evident that the plan of the Giza Plateau was developed based on a model that points to that era. Now, in a lot of the cultures I study, the sites where ceremonial centers and temples were placed were initially marked with standing stones, not with structures. And so I think and a lot of times those stones were natural features in the landscape. So my guess is that there were structures like that, natural formations or standing stones like Giza originally, and that the pyramids were later built over them. And that would argue that they were built sometime later than 10,500 BC. But I believe they're older than the traditional dating of 2,400 or whatever it is.
And what are your thoughts on the recent finds for Bosnian pyramids and Göbekli Tepe, for example? How do they fit into the time frame?
Well, Göbekli Tepe, it fits in major ways with things I'm researching. And the trick is, because it's so very old, it predates writing so far that it challenges someone like me to come up with ways to anchor interpretations that are not based on writings that have survived. And that's a different mindset. But my book on China was actually practice for that, because in China, events that happened around 3000 BC didn't get written down until around 300 BC. And so I was continually in the posture of having to find ways to demonstrate things without having access to written records to do it with. So Göbekli Tepe presents sort of the same kind of situation. There are a number of researchers right now trying to pin down exactly what the relationship of Göbekli Tepe was to all the other cultures, but I think it's definitely in there.
Now, the culture that you mentioned a minute ago that you've been studying in Tibet, what are you finding there as it relates to historical human civilization than any outside of possibly Mu or even other places around the world?
Well, the connections to this culture argue pretty strongly that in favor of the perspective that the Dogon and the Buddhists and other cultures, even the Egyptians have, that certain civilizing skills were taught to them in very ancient times. And the Dogon perspective is that certain of their tribe members were taken away and sequestered at a remote locale and taught skills of agriculture and farming, agriculture, astronomy, stonemasonry, metallurgy, husbandry, and things like that, and then brought back to teach their mates. And you have some of the world where there's this group of 8 teachers who are credited with having brought skills of civilization. Well, the research now supports that idea that all of these skills originated in one spot and spread from that spot. And there are DNA studies and language studies that uphold that viewpoint.
I see what you're saying, and it almost seems to me that, at least from the evidence that we've been able to look at it and gather at this point, that there have been multiple restarts or rebooting of civilization, if you will. Order of things, there are 2 survivors, and those survivors seem to disperse throughout the planet and start and kind of restart or reboot is a term that we both appreciate from the computer side. But it does seem like there's a continual regular cycle of restarting, of civilization starting, flourishing, developing, reaching a certain level of development, some in different ways and others at various levels, and then everything seems to kind of be wiped and washed. And you seeing that kind of cycle throughout mankind's or the human condition that we are seeing that same type of cycle in your studies?
Yes, and that relates a lot to Walter Crittenden's about precession being and its possible relationship to cycles and so forth. And on the culture that you, there are suggestions that some of the cultures look at it as being a natural cycle, and some of the cultures look at it as being something imposed from outside. There's a deliberate resetting, pushing of the button that resets things because somebody bigger than Phil doesn't like the fact that it's gotten as far as it's gotten.
What are your thoughts on the Sumerian stories? Obviously, at least predating, or at least what we know at this point, predating Egyptians and the Anunnaki and even Sitchin's interpretations of those works. What are your thoughts there?
Well, a lot of the Sumerian and Akkadian references dovetail really well with the cultures I study, but again, interpretation is tricky because what some researchers report as being historical, I understand as being cosmological. I'll give you an example in terms of another culture. The Naki, one of the anthropologists I was working with, said there was a confusion because there are these long king lists that are given, and some of the names on that king list clearly were not Tibetan or trying to figure out where did these names come from. But I looked at the list, and I could see that what were being laid out there were not names of historical kings, but they were stages of creation. These are phonetic values that go along with stages of creation. And they wouldn't necessarily be given in the phonetic value of the language of the culture that was being studied, but instead being given in terms of this common civilizing plan that I think existed. And so Sumer got even the term Anunnaki is a term that relates to some Dogon words that are clearly cosmological, not historical. And so you've got a mix of things going on. You've got images that look like could have been physical beings who were reported as being gods, but you've got words that look like they're cosmological references. And we hit this kind of confusion fairly frequently, in China especially, that a lot of the terms that the Dogon consider to be cosmological turn up, supposedly inner knowledge in the Dogon tradition, turn up as public stories that came forward from ancient times. It's as if somebody knew that the tradition couldn't be supported, and they as a last-ditch effort, wrote a story about these terms to keep them alive.
So one of the things to see as we independent as research is the resistance to the orthodox mainstream establishment, academia, papered ones. When anybody comes up with something that is antithetical or completely throws the established thought and theories sideways, a la Velikovsky and what happened to him when he published, there seems to be a significant resistance to anything obviously against, or what are your thoughts on why that is so prevalent when looking at the ancient mythos? One of the things I always look at is, in the myth, why does it, and this is something that David Talbot from Thunderbolts has done with Symbols of an Alien Sky, is asking why do we take the stories as stories that may have been induced by God knows what they could have been at the time, as opposed to a literal account of what do you think is the reason for so much resistance to just looking at things logically as opposed to just some story they came up with to imprint some kind of moral teaching on their people?
Well, we've almost reached a point where, in my mind, it's a good research that the academic perspective in a lot of cases sort of collapses under its own weight. Or at very worst, there's progress being made by this community of researchers that is completely independent. It's on its own path that's separate from, in a lot of ways, from the traditional academic viewpoint, and it's not being held back by lack of approval. And so I joke that if everybody in the world claimed that Twinkies, yeah. So I mean that's the way I look at it. Is I don't need an academic to validate what I'm researching, because what I've got has its own validity.
Well, I think that's an extremely healthy and positive attitude, because there is so much research being done and new discoveries. Obviously, go back to the Tepe. Once that started to be, when Harvard research got in there, it just throws everything, as at least timeline is concerned, civilization, the involvement of it, and the various phases of it on its head. And when you look at how all of a sudden, out of hunter-gatherers in the 4000 BC time frame, these magnificent monuments and technology and writing and all these things just kind of came out of nowhere. It makes you stop and go, well, okay, so where did that come from? And I think that the work that you're doing and the work we're seeing on past civilizations and these cycles that are becoming more and more evident points to the fact that human habitation and civilization on planet Earth goes back a lot farther than what we've been told and are continually being told. And I think we're seeing that across a number of different scientific disciplines.
Yes, one excellent example of that is that the argument that was made against my friend John Anthony West and his colleague Robert Schoch when they suggested the Sphinx was older than traditionally stated. The question was raised, okay, where is the other megalithic construction that shows that this could be done before we say it was done? And sites like Göbekli Tepe are concrete evidence of that. And so the traditional argument evaporates because it's been undercut by the evidence. And that's happening again and again and again in different fields. People are bumping up against limits that are sort of blocking their traditional perspective. I was working with a group of linguists this week. I was in contact with them talking about the kinds of comparisons I was making, and they were very, annoyed that I wasn't following traditional linguistic procedure in trying to compare words. And I tried to explain to them that the way the cosmology works is you have this bundle of values that surround every word. You have multiple meanings, and you have an associated drawing, and sometimes you have there's a stage of cosmology it relates to, and a deity who performs certain actions and has certain icons associated with him and a certain name. And so you take this bundle of values and you go to another culture and you find a match so that you can correlate the two symbols or the two deities. I said, you can't reasonably argue that the two similar names of those deities don't also correlate with that package. And you don't need a traditional linguistic study to make the connection.
And what was the response to that?
Well, it was really mostly annoyance and sort of an unwillingness to go any farther. It's like I had violated the protocol, and it's like I'm not somebody they want. Clearly, I'm not somebody they want to work with.
Well, speaking of deities, one of the other questions I had for you regarding the Dogon is their concept and their hierarchical structure, if you will, and any deities. What did you find about the Dogon's belief system in that regard?
Okay, the Dogon really only have one mythological character who rises to the status of a deity, and that's their creator god, Amma. And even Amma, when you understand the way the language works, really boils down to a concept, a cosmological concept. The phonetic value Am, the concept of knowledge, and in the biblical sense refers to biological procreation. Ma is the concept of perception, which is the initiating stage of matter. So you have the initiating stage of biological reproduction or biological creation tagged to the initiating stage of cosmological creation, and that becomes the concept of their god. Now, everywhere else that the Dogon have mythological characters, the Egyptians have deities, and other cultures eventually evolved deities, even if they started out without having them. And so I see these pantheons of deities as being stages of creation, as representing stages of creation.
Fascinating, and that also translates into the Greeks, the Romans, and even Sumerians, Akkadians, and so forth as well, correct?
Right. By the time you get down to the Greeks, it's become a soap opera, basically.
and then all of that and did some really cool things with it.
Yes.
Linguistically speaking, of course.
That's true. So the trick is to try to find the earliest reference to any concept, and usually that's the one you want to go with. And the real trick is then finding other comparably early references to verify what that says.
Now, the Dogon also, in the way that they described that structure that you just described yourself, they have a kind of a definition of quantum mechanics, kind of a torsion field theory. Is that correct?
That's right. Actually, their creation tradition when it comes to matter is accurately expressed according to a physicist I know who reviewed the structure. He said, the structure is right. Whoever put the structure together knew what they were talking about, and it's a version of torsion theory, which is a controversial version of string theory.
Mm-hmm. And they call that or what it translated to is the egg of the world.
That egg of the world is a pivotal structure. It's basically the string theory's Calabi-Yau space. It's a little bundle of collapsed dimensions that are thought to exist at every point in space and time. The Dogon conceptualize it, like all of their cosmological concepts, they conceptualize it two ways. From one, it's 7 rays of a star of increasing length, and from the other perspective, it's a spiral that defines the endpoints of those rays.
So they say that they got this information from star people from the Sirius planet configuration. Is that correct?
As I studied, one form or another say they got it from an ancient somebody who knew a lot more about it than they did. The Buddhists flatly say human source. The Dogon say it was a non-human source, but they describe the source as being spiritual, that is non-physical rather than material beings, and that these beings were very concerned about what the long-term effects might be of prolonged contact between us and them, the effects on us. And so their solution to that was to sequester a small group at some remote locale and send them back to teach everybody else, and that minimized their contact with us.
And that seems to be a theme throughout the Vedic traditions, Hindu, and the Buddhist stories as well.
That's right. And in one form or another, you have references in a lot of cultures to godlike beings who, anytime they make images of them, a lot of these traditions started out without iconic images. But when they start making these images, looks an awful lot like an alien creature.
So, what are your thoughts then on the story of and the concept theory, etc., of this of the Pleiadians and their involvement in coming from Orion and/or the Sirius region and having some influence or impact on the creation, if you will, of mankind in our evolution?
Okay, well, the same physicist who said that the Dogen creation tradition is torsion theory also said that essentially he implied that science is being conducted on two levels right now. And one way you can see this is if you realize that the amount of time that passed between the first flight of the Wright brothers and the invention of the space shuttle is the same amount of time that has passed since the invention of the space shuttle and now. But the difference is that during this second period of time, when everything technological in the world that we know about has skyrocketed in capability, we haven't moved 1 inch from the space shuttle. And so that said, the science is being conducted on a public level for public consumption and on an entirely different level for the scientific world. And so that we're not really certain what progress has been made and what progress hasn't been made.
So I guess that would say also that as it relates to the history of the human race on the planet Earth, and if you go back and look at all of the various findings that have been that we're coming up with now from Göbekli Tepe and doing further research into not only Atlantis, Lemuria, and Mu, that what we're finding, and what the researchers and people like yourself are finding, are the science, or at least the results and the evidence that science doesn't want to talk about, which may be one of the reasons why there's so much resistance to the facts and the data that's being presented that's, again, antithetical to what they tell us that it should be or is. But we're actually finding that evidence that would be on that, I guess, on the public science side that you just described?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
On the Pleiadians, do you think that there's any truth or any validity in the whole Pleiadian concept?
Well, the same physicist who made these other assertions says that there are numerous different groups that we have had contact with over the years, some of which are friendly and some of which aren't. Mm-hmm. And based on that statement, I can imagine there are all sorts of different perspectives that could be looked at, including from the perspective of the Pleiades, and that some of these might be aliens in the classic UFO, might not.
It's a fascinating journey to look at all of the different pieces of evidence and try to sort out, what was man-made, influenced by maybe more advanced versions of men, maybe as a result of booting that has, which appears to be several times over a long period of time. But one of the things, going back to your torsion theory component, when you've got the helical model that you had mentioned earlier, and Francis Crick, who is credited with the discovery of, had made a statement found fascinating in that he said the current state of DNA akin to a whirlwind or blowing through a junkyard and leaving a Boeing sun in its wake. And indicating that DNA, the structure of DNA, is so old that there's no possible way that what we see as our DNA today could have come into being in what we understand life of is today. day. What do you think about that?
That's very hard to say. I am struck by the similarities of the structure of the universe that look an awful lot like DNA. And so it could be that creation tends to emerge in certain forms, whether it's on the macrocosmic level or the microcosmic, because that's one of the keys of all of these traditions, that what happens above is the same as what happens below. Imagine that this is the way creation happens.
There's some interesting guy by the name of Anthony Peake over in the UK doing some work on consciousness and DNA. He's posited a theory that is actually creating and has a quest of creating itself. And as it relates to what you're saying and what you're seeing in the universe and the structure, the helical structure of DNA throughout both the cosmos as well as here on terra firma, that would seem to possibly have some credence to it. DNA wanting intelligence that's beyond comprehend, and wanting to propagate throughout the universe. Obviously, but something that have more credibility as we look at different things like the helical nature of the universe itself.
Right. It's hard whether this is a natural process that just happened, whether we want to assign intention to it.
In your studies of the and the higher biology itself, you've seen the connection from the relates to the Hebrew, Egyptian, Chinese, and the Buddhism. Have you seen anything on the Egyptian side itself that may have any relationship to other cultures that you've done any research on? In other words, coming out of Egypt.
First of all, Egypt, a lot of other cultures, but what I've been more of the time frame I'm more with influences that look like they played out in Egypt from other. It's hard to say whether you can call the original source Egyptian or not. That's what I'm wrestling with. Is at what point does it believe Egyptian? Was it something else? But a comp for all of these groups, you end up with overlap of concepts and traditions, and so trying to reconcile how did they each come out of the same thing is a very interesting process.
Well, both Steve and Evan down in Australia have turned up some very interesting Egyptian connections, and I think right about nighttime to talk about some of the work that they have and some notes between what they have found down there.
Oh, that's great. That's
Evan and Steve.
We certainly hear you, definitely.
Would you give Laird a review of what you've been doing and what you have found to not only the connections?
Yeah, look, it's really interesting. The last country where Australia's coming in. What I've been scribbling down what's been said was, I think, to this equation is the part of this. In this Australia, we need to understand it's not actually Australia 1770. Before that, it was 5 nations with different languages, different dreaming stories. But within that, there are 2 that transcend every dreaming story. And one is the story of the Pleiades. That is such a constant throughout the whole of this country. It doesn't matter where you came, story of 7 sisters and what took place. And that for us is where we're story. We originally didn't want to get forced into it. We also know it's not only that, the 7 sisters is part of this. There's another saying you heard, didn't we, Evan?
Yep.
Yeah, I think Laird just used it. As on top, so below. In this country.
Everybody says it.
Says that. And what's really important, unlike where they have gods, in Australia we don't. Sky heroes. Gods, they're sky heroes. If I can refer, which obviously has been working on in the Dogon mythology, they actually say here, and I'll use the quote here, that the from a larger being visible as in the Milky Way. It's come from afar. They do come from afar. And what is also in our country is the astronomy and national people are obsessed with it. But the oldest astronomical devices at Wurdi Yuang, and that could be around 20,000 years, we're actually working near Carrion. We found 3,500 star markers within about Carrion, haven't we, Evan?
Yep.
And we're going back down in a couple of weeks to continue. And it is a major obsession with the original people. As on top, so below. They are constantly. In fact, we've got elders who still ring us and talk about 2 things. One, talk about the fact that their ancestors came from Pleiades. Secondly, which links in with what you're talking about also, a lot of elders don't even call this place Australia. They call it Moon. They're quite adamant that this is not Australia, but Lemuria. And that's the second part of what we're working on too. The aims of civilizations in this country are a lot greater than people realise. They're all over the place. And of course down here, Carryong and up where we are now, only remains of an incredibly civilization. And one other thing before I forget, when you guys were talking about catastrophes, Evan and I both thought about the same thing, didn't we?
Yeah, we had that look at each other.
Yeah, a few years ago we went to a place a fair way there, about 30 k's away, and we could compass. 3 of the arms are gone over the top of it. Just about the compass was probably ancient, or we thought it was. And the cuts into rock, and it was the hardest rock, about 1 mil deep, and they went down and straight, perfectly flat down the bottom and 20 degrees the other side. And they were all very, very finely cut, could never have been on rock. It had to be done by, if you believe, a metal up tool would do it. What was really interesting was 46, 47 degrees. Now, I believe that was put in as a marker, a catastrophe way back. And we're quite convinced that part, that catastrophe is country. Although looking at a place at Carryong with Klaus, and we've got hundreds all around Carryong, ancient civilization. We went up the back. We went up and saw this other place where there's not a bird. Our crew ended up in hospital after we came off the place, melted rocks and everywhere. And catastrophic took place. And civilization, so I think what you were saying before, 200,000 years, be where we're looking at the moment too, aren't we?
Yeah.
So in relation to Egyptian carving or symbology, share some of that with Laird, if you will.
All right, I'll do the cuts with 2 come to mind. One's quite famous, and the government and wildlife have got an explanation that haven't been found. Now, those glyphs are fascinating for 2 reasons. Firstly, because I don't believe they're all Egyptian. I believe there's a panel there that Pharaoh's sons, Nebuchadnezzar, that came about 700 years ago, which is absolute. And we've got some old ancient hieroglyphs we've matched, considered the oldest. We found about an 85% match. And in that is very Egyptian. We've got the cartouches up the top, and we see the cartouche for Lord Djed. Every symbol is. But what's really tricky is everyone spoke it's Egyptian, and it is. People haven't picked up is around the other 270 glyphs. We're only getting a 44% match. It's more ancient. And our custodian worked through the original elders, guide us all the way through. And one of our custodians, Auntie Bev Spears, who's the last full descent Darking Young Elder, told us one day, and she had on this for years. She said, yes, Egyptian stuff there, needs to know, is there's a more ancient language, which is theirs. Now, that's the first time we did that path. She said that the Egyptians here, I know that sounds radical, to learn their skills in religion and glyphs and the things that they took back. She made that very clear, that was actually what took place. So at those glyphs, you can see a large bird 38, which is about the story of them being shot. One of the 2 brothers, Nefertari, bitten twice by a snake, and quite clumsy away after the first time, but regardless, and he was supposed to be there. And we may have one, I'm not sure I've done looking at that, but we certainly. The rest is not Egyptian. Yes, I can reckon that the Egyptian, the most ancient form of the derivative of this more ancient, have been taken at the moment.
It would be if there's any between the glyphs that you're and Laird. What do you think of that?
Yeah, Laird was talking. Evan's got it simple on. I haven't looked at it. You started at the thumb. I swear to you, I couldn't the correlations. Really was amazing. We kept, look at that one, look at that. There was some there that I'd misread. Thank you very much, Laird, for that book, because I'm something different. I'm looking at more sense to me. The narrative.
It's better into narrative.
It's narrative. So we're going to make some jigging of that, see in the back, because it makes more sense to us.
Here we get there. Laird, are you still with us?
I think Laird's dropped.
Either that more ancient form of symbol. I have communication. We can't.
Well, why don't we go ahead?
Yeah, why don't we?
Let's go ahead and take a quick break, get a name up, and a little station break, and we'll get back on this.
Okay. You're listening to PFRN, your voice on talk radio. And we're back live on PFRN Radio.
Back now.
You got
There
there.
he is.
I heard most of what the Strongs were saying. I missed the very tail end part, having symbols. That'd be what you've come across.
Yeah,
Let's see what we're gonna-
I showed me your book and I started thumbing through it and I was blown away by the similarities between some of the stuff on the walls and what's there. They were exactly the same symbols. I was quite amazed by it. What is going on here?
I don't know.
What I'm not sure if this is a new site we've just found, which sort of, I suppose Ruby Wright's language was supposed to be created. Now, it was a site that was found in 9 and destroyed, and basically on the radar for about 9 months. And what's written about this was the person who worked on it was the president of the Australian Educational Research Society. He was the president. So he wasn't a left-wing sort of historian just trying to push up. And this is in 1939. And what actually took place was there's 185 standing stones there, and they've got markings. And he claimed it was the first language ever created, the beginning of all language. And we've got all these papers, which were actually found together, or lost, weren't they, mate?
Yeah, they'll found back around.
We've been to see the site. It's amazing. According to an archaeological society, on it, it stood out. Firstly, that he claimed language over 200 different. It's got 10 elements, 17 alphabet letters, 21 body parts, 38 hand signs, 30 suffixes, affixes, and prefixes, and over 100 animals that have meanings. And what later was up to 28 words in a book he was writing. And stepped in and destroyed the whole place, so we won't go down that path because it's been claimed. What we found was, number one, that the first language, according to all the books, be very basic. Basic things and ideas of what they get here, food, today's sex, drugs, and rock and roll, but nothing. Or not, I can't tell.
Yes, there.
I can never turn it down. What happened here was, he was up to 28,000 words. He was pressure buttons during the Second World War, and all this. What we found really interesting is he translated it. He was working with an original, still knew the sacred language. A particular set of stones was called the Mystery Track of Life and Death. And this guy helped him translate it. About one thing, because there were other people language, and we had one on site, didn't we, mate?
Yeah, we
one on site. He had a song of the hand signs and sung the song of the stone arrangements and put it back. Was the narrative. He translated it in 1930. God was the most repeated phrase in the first language, if it is that, was this 3 words, came to earth. It turns up all the narrative. Now, Slater would have known about this in 1930s weren't really mainstream. He was saying, yeah, like he did, to learn this. But I'll give you a quote, Tom. One look at this. Guided by truth, man worth through darkness, from a light that shines far off. Another one says that man came to earth with his 7 senses fully developed. Truth came to earth on wings. It repeats itself time after time. What I find fascinating, one of the top academics and Egyptologists in our country, and he's no narrative, and he doesn't even know it. He has no idea what it actually means. The same thing. He talks about them bringing rod that came west. Now, on these stones, there's 185. By the way, they're all shaped.
Yeah, right angle.
Pyramid shapes and stuff like that. Now, remember, there's no percussion points. This is ancient. Original people have rock on rock and stick on G. These are, we're finding them, aren't we? Because what happened was the whole site, that the rocks around and under the ground. They're everywhere. Stone, because this is and there's no deposit stone for a long way off, thousands of ton of site. Original technology, because the closest sandstone to quarry is Tway. Now, we've since, where they were bringing the sandstone down, tens of thousands of shaped rocks. Now, which means this was where they're basically dictionary and sending it out to different places. We've only found one. What we're finding there is the between the standing stones is the walls at Gosford. In fact, in one of the Wake Up World, both of them into 4 degrees. And it's a theme throughout. It's about people coming from afar, creating us with a divine right, about the evil one. Something went up the gods. And that's one theme. And now these two sites are separated by about 100 kilometres. One, I think, is a more divine form. Just stately, as Slater said, all knowledge and all language, but you called it the old 800 Gosford, you get the 101. This simply put out the glyph, the same, and that's about UFOs crashing here, doesn't it, mate?
Yeah, it does.
It does. It talks about UFOs place. So, in two different pieces of archaeology, one which was hidden months ago, and by God, as a course, since it's come out, we have original about who owns it now, this sort of stuff. But the same story. It's the same story. So it makes me wonder, the academics in our countries, and what's the thing, directly above the Gosford glyph, there is a set of star markers, there, the closest ones to it, dated 15 years ago, to before over 600 years old. An effort to Shabu is supposed to have taken place around 1,700 years ago. Exactly. Well, that map was lost by Sydney Uni. They said they can't find it, and the person who originally couldn't find it. 3 weeks ago, we got a hold of it, and it actually says that is a star chart that is 1,600 years old. What's sad about that are two things. Number one, no academic in this country has gone near it, and we've known about it, no one's even bothered to look. The other part is it's been vandalised. So we've definitely got here an astronomy that goes way back, just the sky above, and we've seen a narrative in archaeology. We've got the present Archaeological Society up one end, and we've got the Gosford glyphs down the other, telling us exactly the same story. We sort of feel like this is the Pleiadian part of this arrangement. Yes, they were genetically mid-placed. We have no doubt the Syrians would be there, and probably not for the right reasons. We suspect the Pleiadians, when they created something here, didn't create it as a vassal. And we believe, looking for that first source, where someone's gone out to other people, came from Australia, of course, but they went at Pleiadian story, which we call the dreaming. And that's basically the original tenet on how to live their lives. And we believe the dreaming culture between Homo sapien, Homo erectus, whatever, which is terrestrial and extraterrestrial, and what we have today in this country, the original people, they'll all tell you the same thing. They came from the skies and they did not come from Africa. They are united now. An elder who said they'd come from Africa.
No,
no, not one. And we were very much a plea about sky heroes from above who come down here by Olin, the first gods, came to this place. We even know the landing platform at Mount Yengo, don't we? Where he's supposed to have landed by army. It is a story about UFOs. In fact, if you go to the glyphs, the most common glyph there, it's not Dogong, it's just UFOs. Everyone calls them, there's 8 of them there. Some of them crashing, some of the right way around. Definitely a story there, but we have no doubt now are all is Pleiadian.
You still with us? Laird?
Sorry? Ah, yeah, it'd be great if he was.
Yep, there you are.
Oh.
Did you get that, Laird, what Stephen and Evan were just talking about? Stephen, Evan, are you...
Yeah, we're definitely still...
We're sort of hoping to engage in a conversation with Laird, but that's probably not going to happen, is it?
I think there is a problem with Laird's line.
Yeah, I think so.
Unfortunately.
Unfortunately, but yeah, he has a ad for sure, man. The connections to the Pleiadians, there's B, the Dogons.
Yeah, trying to cross circuit to be here.
No, I'm having real problems with Laird's line. Everyone else is fine.
They're trying again.
Yeah, it'd be very interesting to see what he thinks and study of the Dogon cosmology.
Well, I think, Laird, are you here?
Very keen to talk to Laird. Well, we both were to talk about the dreaming stories there.
Yeah.
In our country here, according to some study that was done recently by Georg, the oldest serpent in the world, the rainbow serpent, which is between 9,000 to 7,000 years old, Australia. What we find really interesting about the serpent depictions is that, according to Georg Chalupa, who is the expert on it, it's a snake-like body with curved horns. die exactly the same way. The original picture would be as obvious. That's going to...
Well, Stephen, a bit more while we're trying to get Laird, about what you found, particularly in Laird's books regarding what were some of the specifics that you saw as far as even some of the stories that got at you and said, oh my God, did we hear that is a connection?
Well, I'll give you one straight. The important one is a second set of glyphs. Right? Now, everyone's claimed the first set of glyphs are fake. We found a second set, 1/3 the size, about what, half or 1/3 the inscription, Evan?
Yeah.
And much different. And what was interesting is, straight away, the 4 down the bottom, there were 4 glyphs down the bottom that really, I couldn't read one, but I can now by looking at them. Now, the ones we had were this. Now, I would this because people might start looking for it, and we really don't want them. A lot of people studying Aboriginal archaeology, so we'd have to be very careful about that. The ones that we saw was this. The first one said coffin. And we thought, okay, that there's supposed to be that Nefertari was buried near the glyphs. And we know there's a back shaft that goes. You see that on our website, and it's amazing. And we thought, so we thought the one underneath said back shaft, which was a glyph, because that's where the shaft.
Yeah, I'm here. Where are you based out of now, Laird? Or you're not in Oregon anymore?
Albany, New York. My wife and I lived in Oregon late 70s for a few years, long enough for her to know what Oregon was, and then we ended up, the gravitational pull of her family was too strong.
I can understand that. What do they say? Live in New York once, or what was it? Live in New York once, but leave before it makes you too hard, and live in Oregon once and leave before it makes you too soft. I'm originally from Los Angeles. Grew up there in the 60s when it was quite a bit different than it is now. But now I'm in Atlanta.
Oh, Atlanta.
Yeah, it's a lot different than I expected. The thought South and some of the stereotypes of people in the South are here. But I spent 9 seasons up in the Midwest in Chicago and got a good taste of that. I've been here for about 19 years now.
Oh.
And it's really quite nice. Great climate. It has a lot of the undulating terrain like the Pacific Northwest and some annual green trees and flora, so forth. So it can be quite nice.
Oh, that's great. I haven't spent a lot of time in Atlanta, but it strikes me as being a really nice place.
Yep, I've very happy spending the time here. I have my daughters got raised down here, and they're now off doing their own thing. So it's kind of nice to be here in some decent weather.
We had a really beautiful fall up until just very recently. It turned colder, but still we haven't. It's not bad. I can't complain about it.
Well, it won't be long before you start getting some of those nice snow drifts and storms up that way.
Yeah, Albany is actually pretty well located. That a lot of times the storms are west or off to our east, and we end up not getting hit very hard.
Mm-hmm. Stephen Long were some of the glyphs and the stories and the symbols, and just before we lost them, while we were trying to see if you were still online, we were going to ask you what correlation you may see or know of in the Dogon mythology that you've studied and what they had described. Stephen Evans seemed to think that there's this universal or original common language that they're seeing down there. And I was wondering myself what, from the Dogon mythology, they have obviously a language. I think most of it's in symbology. They didn't really have any written language, did they?
No, they didn't have a written language. And what I'm seeing at Göbekli Tepe and some of the other archaic sites is sort of a proto-language where, and a lot of it, you'll appreciate this from Taoism, a lot of it's given in terms of animals. And the pronunciation of the animal name was a homonym for a cosmological term, and so they associated stages of creation with the animals. And so even the images on the megaliths at Göbekli Tepe, it looks as if a hunter-gatherer could walk up, see the picture of an animal, and speak the name of the animal which he knew, and actually be saying the term of cosmology that he might have been studying there.
Well, that's fascinating. Wow. What do you think? Are you familiar with Randall Carlson and his work on catastrophism?
No, I'm not. What does he have to say?
Well, he's down here in Atlanta, and he's got a site called Sacred Geometry International, and he's a builder by trade, but degree in geometry. His fascination has both the symbology that are found in various civilizations and their mythos, and how that correlates to catastrophist studies. And that was some of the points I was making earlier about the end of the last ice age and having what seems to be kind of a rebooting of civilization around that time.
Right.
And looking at maybe, the various correlations and or causations of what may have actually ended the last ice age. I get into a lot of discussions regarding, this global or climate change theme or meme, if you will, that's out there. And I'm just not convinced at all that it's the man-made contribution that the mainstream keeps pushing. There seems to be too many holes in the scientific model and what they're promoting as the causation of it.
Right.
And when you look at geology, particularly when you look at the ice core samples from both Antarctica and Greenland, cycle of interglacial periods. And is somebody else on? No, I guess it's just us. And there seems to be a cycle of these glacial and interglacial periods, and we are in, obviously, an interglacial period at this point. Some of the work that he's done shows that if you look over the last 250,000 years, there's the regular cycle, and average interglacial periods, or average time that the interglacial periods seem to come, and the interglacial that we're in.
I'm just getting to the...
I was going to show how he's actually rewriting our interpretation of the glyphs.
Right. Anyway, Bobby got it ironed out.
Okay, we were at Laird. They're on a different...
He call in his, I guess that's off.
Right.
So we'll just have...
His picture.
He's, I guess he's not... There, Robert.
Got okay, yeah.
All right, should we
Or not.
Oh, yes.
Oh, well, we may as well continue and at least say something. And
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Please do. Please do.
Yeah, okay. Look, we're just starting to learn where we are in Australia. Got no one else to work off because no one's looked for this sort of stuff anyway. To keep looking at things and then finding out, have we got it right, I'm really after going through the Backlard's book there, one of the women I just thought, which is quite impressive, according to Laird, it means something completely different. It means a best exists. Now, we find that really interesting in place, and I've got another one here, the earth is bent on the walls. What's interesting about that, I don't know what you call it, it's a healing table. It's above there. It's a rock that's been melted in like a shelf and placed a shelf. There are pictures up on our website and stuff like that.
I'm pretty sure I've got one there.
Well, the trick is that it's only for women. We were told about this way back at the beginning. And the elder said this is a healing table, and he also said it was a portal, which is why the idea of bending place that Laird has put in his book really grabs us, because I've watched 14 different women lay on that table. I've never told history in advance about what's happened to the other women. Each one has gone in blind. Mind you, there've been 5, one after the other, but I never said to anyone wanting like that. All 14 women have come off that table with stunned awe. A lot of them have spoken about that they felt like they were travelling in a space, stars rushing past them, and they felt they were going somewhere. They felt like they completely healed. Stayed there long enough. One woman that got off was quite amazing. The people who were there said, "My has changed, looking like a different human." She said, "It's another dimension." We think it's a portal by the original people. I'm reread help of sacred symbols of the word over and over. The earth is bent, bending place. Well, that's what this place is. So it sort of gives us the indication that it may well be. We still haven't got the translation. I have to go back and do it again. I have to take his book along with us. Symbols there I've seen that I didn't recognise them before. When I was talking about, I don't know if this, did we get cut out when I started talking about the glyphs where there was a story of a funeral or not? Did we get to that or not? Were we cut out? I'm not sure.
I think we got cut out, Steve. Sorry.
All right. Well, I'll get back to that bit and see if we can get to that. What I was saying was, there was one set of glyphs that everyone, and they all claim it's fake. What I don't know about is there's a glyphs, I think 13
or 14.
Yeah, 13 or 14 glyphs of the same style, and about 40 you recognise again, so we suspect it could be a combination of ancient language and Egyptian. But down the bottom there was, we knew one said death. The other one said back shaft it's at the back of the shaft that was chiseled out. The one that represented a sacred shaft Pharaoh, the son of the Pharaoh, could take as they go into the afterlife and cross the river. And this was the spirits. The last one I assumed was a distance marker. Right. According to Laird, perception comes to be. What I'm trying to find here is that if I look at Laird to the back here, what he's given us there, doesn't it?
It does. It really does. The penguin element.
So we talk as that space and that weight and stuff like that. If I look at what I'm finding stuff that makes me feel like that it's esoteric than I first thought, which makes it more like the standing stones, doesn't it?
It does. It really does.
Because there were parts of the inscription, the parts are the same, there's some different interest, but looking at studying the full thing, in narrative on both. And I'm going to need to go back and look at it some more again. We have about 3 weeks and see if we can find what else is going on there from you, Anne. I could talk to Laird about it. That would be good.
Okay, I just heard what you were saying.
Oh, wonderful.
The glyph that I list good symbols of that comes to be that
that's fun.
That represents for me the idea of a concept.
Oh, look, that fits. And the bending place, what's really grabbed me, because we've seen it all that obviously represent bending place. What actually does a bending place mean, Laird?
Okay, you're talking about which glyph you...
It's the star with 5 sides, or 5 pointed star on page 1 in your English. Yes. Yeah. Bending place. What is that about? Because that really stands out. That one is really to be a major priority. So I find that really interesting. This is being somewhat apart. Yeah.
Okay, that's the symbol enclosed represents the egg of the world. It's the Calabi space of string theory. It's the wrapped up dimensions that at every point in space and time.
Well, that really does fit in pretty well with the place we're at. And I've got to find it again. The one about civilization. There's a cross with a circle over the top. You've got one with I've got to find it again. And I thought it represented ancient civilization of some sort because I found it somewhere else. Because that was one part of the narrative I didn't mention. There's a lot of ancient civilization there. I'm starting to wonder, but we can't find it at the moment, unfortunately, because I was just thumbing through this gently as we were talking. Oh, and the 3 sets of white. I see that it's got the, which is the same one we got, Mu.
Right.
This one,
Mu means a number of things. I mean, Mu is the phonetic root of a word that means mother. It's a symbol of the mother goddess. Also representing the primordial waves, matter is created from, that underlie matter in its wave-like form.
A lot of sense because above it is the largest engraving on the 2 walls of the pyramid.
Oh, of course.
It's there, and it sits underneath and supports those 3. Those 3 waves support the pyramid.
Oh, that makes sense because the pyramid, for me, a symbol of mass, comes from waves.
All right, and then inside that, I remember insignia there for complete, beheld, known.
Oh, it is. Yeah.
We can actually go back down there in 3 weeks with your book that Evan finally bought. Thank you for that. Not now, but I will be for sure. I've looked at bits of it, but not in the detail I am now. And so many of those symbols there. Earth is there, space, a mass, gravity exists. That one.
Oh yeah, that one.
Gravity.
Definitely there.
There is so much there.
what they're doing there has laying out stages of creation.
Oh, that part we did get right, because we said at the start, this is the creation of humanity. But we haven't picked up these finer ones we're now starting to find out through your book there that actually complement what we'd read. Though the ones that we dismissed as being we're not sure what they are, I can now find most of them there. I've got gravity exists. Yeah, it's going to make a difference we go down there. I'm glad we actually, even though you've come up, I'm glad we got to talk and see that. This one, two toward, remember that one? That's everywhere. Place, much in common between the walls. Laird, and what you've got in your book, it's quite amazing, actually.
Now, what's interesting, one thing to keep in mind is that, at least for the Dogon, there are creational themes. There's one that talks about matter, a second one that talks about the universe, and a third one that's talking about biology, and they use the same set of symbols to present all three. So context is important, and clues about context. In Egypt, they give you the clues based on kinds of metaphors, one with animals of the animal. If involved, we're talking about 4 stages of creation. Insects represent a stage, the earliest stage, the second stage, 4-legged animals the third stage, and birds the fourth stage. But there are other metaphors there, and depending on what others might tell you what context they're.
All those from the walls, all there. We've got insects, we've got birds, we've got the fish. They're all there. Interesting. What if I can share with them? Near that we think the Cree is there's a glyph that keeps reappearing, but don't you, mate?
Yes, I do.
I think it's chemical, and but chemical we understood when it horizontally. These together, 3 circles plus legs. A bit further down, it's plus legs plus arms. And it's 3 arms, and in each hand he holds a pyramid. Yeah. And there's a gradation there, and we think there's one that represents a laboratory. So we're inclined to think the first one, because the very first symbol on this wall is just a stick figure of a human. It's a proper stick figure. I've never seen that in Egyptian hieroglyphs anywhere. And it sort of like stands out to begin with, and it sort of gave us the impression this is a statement about how humanity was made. And as you go through that first narrative, you see how this thing runs. And in the final stage, you've got a circled figure with arms and legs, and then a huge sort of ellipse coming out of the stomach. That's the creation of something or not. But we tend to feel like what we've got in your book there with those other symbols we couldn't recognise. You've given us a lot of the symbols we actually couldn't pick up yet. It's going to make it a much tighter translation. The ellipse coming out of the is probably related to the concept of ascension. That's enlightenment or ascension. It's because that's where ascension begins in terms of biologically, the concept of ascension or of enlightenment begins at the navel and then moves upward, in a perfect case, through the top of the head. Mm-hmm. And that makes a lot of sense. Should be given in terms of a spiral, probably. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Well, we have one. Sonia's saying it represents the Queen Bee, the creator. So yeah, I can see that. Yeah, and we've got. Yep. Yeah, it's great. I mean, this actually makes a difference. We'll take your book down. It will be actually in the wall, between the wall, and we'll say a little prayer and thank you for it, because it's part of what we time.
If there's anyone can be in contact with me while you're, I'd be happy to talk you through.
Oh, we'll certainly look, as we could actually send across pictures while we're doing that, because we've got some people that are with us that are going on that understand technology. Don't. I'm actually a founding member of the Luddite Society, and when the satellites fall, everyone will come back to me. In the meantime, I just sit back and watch. But
yes, I joke that my cell phone tech form.
I can't even answer a mobile, can I? Even
no,
more dial on it.
I have to do it for him.
So when I go on the site, I the old mess pen and paper from there. It's past that. We could do that. We could send you pictures of stuff while we get your take on that, because I think what we've got is a general understanding is we believe that parting there, that there's something that went wrong. There was UFOs. There was a creation. We were created. We haven't got the nuances. Part is. Second part, we've been told by original people and others, is prophetic. There's a prophecy at the end of the third. Can't read it, but I saw quite a few of your symbols are. So we're going to go back and look at that. We've been to this, that both these things are in the future. It was this one. Well, I reckon we might get a bit. Oh.
Now, on this list of interpreted glyph phonetic values that you're looking at, where those come from, they start with, there's a glyphs at the front of Budge's dictionary, and sometimes next to the glyph, he'll list a set of explanatory that are there to explain the pronunciation of the glyph. And those glyphs have meaning for me. So what I've done is I've laid out what those explanatory glyphs seem to represent as my phonetic interpretation. But that can be tempered by what the Dogon and Buddhists say the glyph means or the shape means.
Yep. And I think we've just read something. We're out of time. Let's wrap up okay. I think we're at the wrap-up stage. Is that right, Bob?
Yeah, guys.
Unfortunately.
Get 5 more minutes.
5 more
Now,
minutes.
you guys can find me on Facebook, and if you send me an email address, we can be in, my email address is my last name, Scranton, l@aol.com.
Evan's writing that down for us right now.
And I can do for you, I'd be glad to do.
We really appreciate it.
We will take, when we're between the walls, look out for a phone call. We better make sure the times are right. Oh, yeah. We might be ringing at 1 o'clock in the morning. We'll check on
That's fine.
Guys,
Go ahead, Bob.
thank Laird for stopping in and his vast amount of us. And Evan and Stephen, thanks for stopping in also. I knew you two guys would definitely prove to be a global connection that needs to be made. So we'll do this one again. Next time, hopefully, we won't have the techniques. But I'd love to have you guys.
First time.
Pardon?
That was definitely better than the first one.
Yeah. Without doubt, this is a huge step forward.
Yeah, the problem is every time we say the Strongs, it just all goes to hell.
Oh, we know so many times. You know, we can't even get on. We can't even get on local ABC radio with our stuff. They won't touch us. In fact,
I can believe that.
That is true, though. Every time we brought you on, man, somebody, somehow, somewhere, they do something, and it just disrupts the whole thing. But next time, we're not going to let that. So we can have this a repeat here, and you guys can really share some of this stuff with us. Even more fascinated. It is connecting like this, and I just knew it was gonna. And you know, I just love it sometimes when you get that positive feeling from knowing something is gonna happen. So
I know, it's wonderful.
Oh, great, Bob. Thank you very much. And if we wait a couple of years, we can do this telepathically.
I look forward to that.
How the radio is. Yeah, that's a good way to do it. They can't
I'm
jam
on
that.
That would be wonderful. Can we do the cappuccino telepathically as well?
Sadly, no.
No, not at all.
But anyway, Bobby K for helping us out here, in this, and we'll put together another show and continue to go forward. And maybe we're going to have to come up with a code name for Stephen Evans.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
The Down Under team. But Bobby, we do appreciate these moments where we can spread the new information connections.
We're going to do it. Just honored to be part of it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Bobby. Laird, it's a pleasure meeting you and having a chance to chat. Evan and Stephen, as always, Bob and Nan, everybody else, looking forward to the next one.
Me too.
Okay, thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, bye.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye.
Right now on a fifth in the computer on the way, about different aspects of ancient cosmological traditions and language. Basically, my approach is to compare similar traditions, sort of the same way that English scholars tried to reconcile various versions of Shakespeare's plays to come up with definitive versions, and that's basically what I see myself as doing. I try to learn more through these comparisons of symbols and language and myths, and my understanding at this point is that I'm looking at traditions that started out very similarly to one another, but evolved somewhat differently from each other.
It's quite fascinating how there's been so much diversity as far as the different civilizations and cultures throughout time, symbology, and there's a lot of connections that you found.
Yes, there are a lot, and part of the process is trying to come up with ways, make correlations that are what I call anchored. The big risk for someone like me is really their own wishfulness, the idea that we're wired to see certain patterns. You look up in the sky and you see a cloud, and what child hasn't imagined pictures that aren't really there, but your brain puts them there. When you're researching ancient mysteries, you have to find ways of preventing your own brain from doing that.
Yeah, and that seems to have come through your work on the Dogon. One of the things that you have found, and I think you had actually in relation to the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphology with the Dogon. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. When I first got interested, because they had some astronomical knowledge they shouldn't have, because they are what's called a modern-day primitive tribe. It's a tribe that still exists, where you can sit down and talk to a living priest, but they don't have technology the way we do. They don't have probes. And so they knew some things about the stars of Sirius. They knew that there were really 2 stars there, not 1. And they knew the orbital period for the 2 stars. But when I got into looking at the tradition, I discovered that it was sort of a crossroads for ancient religions. They do some things like ancient Judaism and some things like ancient Egypt and other things like ancient Buddhism. And so I figured whatever I learned about that culture was going to tell me a lot about these other cultures.
And what you found is something called, in Buddhism, adequate symbols?
That's one of the things that I found. The concept in Buddhism of an adequate symbol is the idea of a symbol that can't lose its meaning. Even if the long trail of initiates who study it forget what it means, the symbol still retains its meaning. And I realized that the only way that could happen is if the symbol was the image of something that you could actually see in nature. And so in the Dogon tradition, where they're describing how their tribal god created matter, they're using the shape of an electron orbit to represent the concept of an electron. And there's several other shapes in the cosmology where these are things that you can actually, if you had the right equipment, you could actually image the thing. You use an electron microscope and you can produce an image that looks just like what the Dogon drawing is.
And that seems to permeate throughout the various, well, if you look at the Dogon symbology and their mythology, there's a lot of people who have talked about them over the last decade or two. And I think one of the myths may be that people have, I think it was probably from Robert Temple's book, about how the Dogon said that they came from Sirius, but that's not really what they said. Is that correct?
Well, there are connections. Okay, there are connections to Sirius, just as there are in a lot of the ancient creation traditions. But one of the tricks in dealing with this material spirit, he was working from ancient texts. He was working from ancient myths, and he was trying to again distinguish between what were factual statements and what were mythical or symbolic statements. And so I had been interested in Velikovsky for many years because I went to high school in Portland, Oregon, which had been a seat of student support for him back in the 1950s when he wrote. And so I knew about his controversial books, and I had always wanted to write a book that would talk about how the latest science applied to his theories.
And do you see anything in the Dogon mythology that made some of the cosmological work that Velikovsky came up with? In other words, is there any correlation between some of the things that they talk about in their history and what Velikovsky, particularly as you look in that 750 to 1500 BC time frame when there was, the changes that occurred both in climate as well as in the calendrical understanding of various cultures? Do you see anything in the Dogon stories that may prove or indicate some of Velikovsky's theories might have some justification to them?
Well, one area in particular you touched on were the calendars. The Dogon have all the same calendars that ancient Egypt had. And the Dogon references look as if they are very early Egyptian references, which means they would date from around 3000 BC, not 1500. And that's an advantage to have a culture to compare to that preserves that. Some examples are they have the calendar without the intercalary days that were added early in Egypt, and they have all the cosmology, but they don't have the written language, which also appeared early in Egypt. So it looks like we're looking at a very early version here. So having the Dogon calendars to compare to gave me a point of reference to try to judge one of Velikovsky's claims, is trying to distinguish what's a mythical statement from what's supposed to be taken as a factual statement. And part of what helps us pin that down is examining the words. There are some conventions that somebody used when they put this system together that make it easier for somebody like me. For example, every term of the cosmology carries at least two meanings, and those meanings are distanced from one another logically, so that knowing the first meaning doesn't let you guess the second meaning. And so now when you find the same disconnected meanings associated with the same concept in another culture, sometimes associated with the same pronunciation and sometimes not, you have a lock on a correlation between the terms. You know they're talking about the same thing. And the more cultures you can get aligned that way, where they're all talking about the same thing, the more of a three-dimensional picture you can get of what they're talking about.
And how does that translate into the connection you found with the Egyptian hieroglyphs?
Okay, well, I noticed that there were a set of Dogon drawings. Every time they talk about a concept, their priests say that they are incapable of talking about a concept without also drawing it. So they have drawings associated with each concept, and I noticed that some of those drawings looked like Egyptian hieroglyphs and actually carried the same symbolism as the Egyptian hieroglyph was thought to have. And so I started asking myself, is it possible that these symbols of writing some of the symbols of writing came out of the pre-existing cosmology? And I started examining Egyptian words and discovered some pretty interesting things about the words.
Now, you've also written a book, it's called the Velikovsky Heresies. Do you see any connection between some of the Dogon mythologies and some of the research and work of Velikovsky?
Well, the connection is more that Velikovsky is sort of a kindred.
Hey, thanks, Bobby, for having us on again. I'm going to pass it over to Robert Bauer and let him take it over.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Bob Newton, and thank you, Bobby, and everybody else involved on the show tonight. This is the fourth in the series of the USOKS radio programs on global connections. And we have a very interesting guest tonight, Laird Scranton, who has got a fascinating background as well as a lot of research that he has done over the years, and we're going to get into that. We also have Stephen Strong. Are we okay?
Yeah, we're okay.
Yep. We've got Evan and Stephen Strong down in Oz, and they'll be talking about some of the research as well. So let's Laird, I got to tell you, your background is both in English as well as in technology and computer programming is something both near and dear to my heart. And as a autodidactic semiotician, I think we're going to find some interesting stuff to talk about in the work that you've done. But before we get into that, why don't you give us a little bit of a background on yourself so that the listeners can have a better idea of where some of the research that you've done has generated from.
Okay. Well, thanks very much, Robert. I really appreciate talking with you guys today. My background was as a software designer. My degree, as you said, was in English. And I became interested in ancient mysteries in the early 1990s when my wife gave me a book about ancient mysteries that put me on to a little tribe called the Dogon in Africa, a modern-day tribe. And so 3 books on cosmology. I have a 4th at the publisher right